Hi, Steve Andrews here, and today we're going to do the books that made me. A top 15, it's probably more than 15, but thereabouts. People do science fiction for beginners, and as a professional bookseller of nearly 40 years standing, I can tell you that recommending books for people isn't as easy as you think, because people will get it wrong a lot, because there's no such thing as a good book. There's only a good book for the individual person. And of course, for a beginner, what does a beginner mean? Does it mean somebody who's never read a book in his life? Does it mean somebody who's only ever read classics in her life? Does it mean somebody who's only ever read mainstream fiction? You know, is it somebody who is young? Is it somebody who is mature? Is it somebody who's old? So how do you do it? And you need to know what sort of taste that person has. You know, if they love Star Trek, but they can't really get on with David Cronenberg's films, you know, there's no point in sort of going down certain sort of routes. So it's a lot harder than people say. So I've been thinking about this. And before I commit myself to such an escapade, something that occurred to me was that it would be nice to talk about the books that made me, the sort of books which formed my taste and my reading. And specifically, I want to talk about SF, because I read other things as well. And I was a big comics reader as a kid. I was a big Marvel fan. And I read lots of natural history and science and history. Those are my things. Boys generally tend to prefer non-fiction. And the number of times I've had concerned parents in the various bookshops I've worked in saying, oh, my son won't read, you know, and I'll say to them, well, you know, if you think he's going to read loads of novels like your daughter, it's not essentially going to go that way. Boys will tend to go more for ideas early on rather than emotive stuff, but everybody's different, you know, it's the way it is. So we'll just talk about a few things today, and I'm going to try and do them in chronological order, and where possible I'm going to show you the actual editions which I still have, which I bought, and this is roughly the order I read them in. So we're beginning with this handsome beast on the podium here, and this was my first adult paperback. This was my first science fiction novel, and it's The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, as you can see, the first of the Professor Challenger stories. The others, of course, are sort of short stories, really, The Poison Belt, things like that. This is the only complete novel. And I was a dinosaur nut as a kid, and I sort of badgered my parents to buy me this. And this, as you see, is 3 and 6, unabridged. And there you go. And I was sort of, I say dinosaur nut, and I sort of had lots of non-fiction books about dinosaurs. And I wanted to read a novel with dinosaurs in. And this here is actually not my original one. I often say it is, but it's not, because this was reprinted in 1964. Mine had the same cover, and mine was bought in 1969. And I don't have it anymore. I don't know why I got rid of it or what happened to it. But this is the same livery, but it's a different copy, and it's in better nick than mine, because mine was in such a state. I don't have it anymore. What did I get rid of that? You know, you should hang on to these seminal things, but so often you don't. You move on in life. You think, I've been there, I've done that, but it's time to put away childish things, and that's it. So the definitive Edwardian British SF novel about a lost world with dinosaurs. And I struggled to read this when I was a kid, because I was only 6.5, maybe 7, maybe it was 1970 when I was bought this. And let's have a look. When was it first published? It was published in 1912, which is interesting because it ties in with another writer I'm going to talk about later, Edgar Rice Burroughs, who produced his seminal works, his most important works, round about that time. Of course, there are sort of 3 or 4 very important things by Burroughs. So this was the thing. And I loved bits of it. Something I struggled with, of course, I was leafing through to try and find the bits about the prehistoric animals, but it's got wonderful characters, and the basic sort of idea is that you have this rather crusty, old, hairy, bellicose professor called Professor Challenger, who is, he's a real one-off, and he's a great character. He's very irreverent. He doesn't really care about people's feelings. He cares about science. He's quite rude. And he is convinced that there is a plateau in Latin America where there are dinosaurs still surviving, and he aims to present evidence to this. And he's challenged by another professor who was called Summerlee. He was also brilliantly drawn. to sort of prove this, and they go on this expedition, and with them goes a sort of great sort of white hunter type figure, an explorer called Lord John Roxton, who's sort of like a solid Buchan-esque character, and a young reporter, an Irish reporter called Edward Malone, who likes rugby, and he's obsessed with this girl called Gladys, and he wants to show her that he is sort of the man for her. So he goes off on this expedition, and it's a book which is full of things like little diagrams and maps, and there's lots of incident, and you get the whole journey. So it's in that sort of Vernian thing of a exploration. It's a travel narrative, but lo and behold, the explorers get to South America. They get to the plateau where before them somebody called Maple White has been, and Maple White has sort of mysteriously vanished, and he left a diary, and there's all sorts of little bits of evidence to suggest there are still dinosaurs living. And if you've never read it, it's absolutely wonderful. And I've read it loads of times, and when I was a kid I wouldn't be defeated by a text. I would go back to it time and time again if it's something I was interested in. So I say, if you have young children you're trying to get them to read, pick something they're interested in, because they will persevere then if they want to get that information. So that's my best advice I can give to any beginner for a young person, not essentially this book. Pick something interesting. So I was a dinosaur nut, as I say, so it was really, really important. And it's characterful, it's pacey, there's loads of fascinating detail and twists and turns, and it's the very richness of the book which still appeals to me now, and I can pick it up and it's just wonderful, and there's all sorts of twists. The characters are beautifully drawn, and you can see why Conan Doyle was so popular. You can see why Sherlock Holmes was so popular. You can see why Brigadier Gerard, all these things. And it's just absolutely marvellous. And it's Edwardian, and the Edwardian period, of course, is a short period. Came after the long Victorian era. At this point, Wells has done most of his keynote works, and he's moving into different areas. He's still writing SF. Of course, Wells had been around since 1895, so he was long established. He was part of that sort of British scientific romance tradition, and it's just wonderful. And you'll never read a better book about dinosaurs. So that was my first sort of sortie. There were probably other things. I did have a Wells sort of, not a Wells omnibus, I did have a Verne omnibus, which my uncle bought me, which was illustrated, and it was abridged, and it had, let's see, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, it had Around the World in 80 Days, From the Earth to the Moon, not the famous ones, and it was abridged. Like a lot of Verne things, the translations were dodgy and stuff, and it's only really in the last sort of 20, 30 years there's been really good translations into English of Verne's work, so he's well worth revisiting. So I sort of experienced those as well, and that was great fun, but they were highly abridged and illustrated, but I really loved them. It's about that time I read an abridged illustrated version of Beowulf as well. So this is sort of when I'm between about 7 and 10. The next book I remember buying, there may well have been others, and I might be slightly wrong with the chronology, was this copy of The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. And I don't know how I came across it. I hadn't seen the film. Wyndham, of course, had only been dead a few years. He died in 66. He was quite young. And this was a really famous book then. And let's see. This one is from 73. So I was 10. So there was a long sort of period when I was just reading things like this, trying to read them, reading comics, other things. So this was 73, and there it is. And that's my original one, and boy, it's in a state. And I do love these covers. I have every single Wyndham book issued with this livery because I bought them new, of course. And it's seen a lot of action. It really, really has. Look at that. And again, it was a challenging read for a 10-year-old at that time. And I loved it though, and it was fantastic, and all the stuff about the coming of the Triffids, the meteor shower, which is actually a satellite weapon, as I've said before. If you do a close read, it's that. And the Englishness of it and the realism. And Day of the Triffids isn't quite as exciting a book, I don't think, as say the Chrysalids, which is the other one I would mention here. And that was one I really, really loved, and I reread that a lot in those years. And I bought all the Wyndhams between being about 10 and 12. I had them all, and I read the short stories. I really sort of got into them, and I started reading the sort of earlier material when I was about 14, because it was all available in Coronet NEL. So this was a great one, and obviously it's a famous book. It doesn't need much of an introduction, and I'll just show you. There you go. I've sort of signed the inside. side there and made all sorts of notes and stuff on it, as kids do, you know. And it's got SF stroke horror book 2. So that was the second science fiction book I bought. So I must have written number 1 in my Lost Worlds. So there you go. So that's an interesting thing. So there's a positive proof there about what I was doing. So Wyndham really, alongside Wells, who I read around about the same time, and Conan Doyle, they forged my SF sensibility in terms of prose. Now, I've been reading Marvel comics. The first reprints were black and white ones, and then very end of the 60s, they started doing Mighty World of Marvel, which initially was in colour, and Spider-Man Comics Weekly, and they soon went black and white, but they had slick covers. And I read all the classic Silver Age Marvel stuff. And Stan Lee, wonderful writer and editor, brilliant artists like Kirby and Ditko, you know, and just great stuff. And then Roy Thomas come along and he elevated the prose even more. So I had good literary chaps even on the US side of things. But at this point I was reading strictly British SF. And it was relatable because I was British. I'd look at other things, but these were the names. So moving on to Wells, this is my original copy of The War of the Worlds. And this is my first H.G. Wells. And as you can see, it's seen a lot of action. And a while ago, you'll have seen in the book haul, I picked up another copy in really great condition, near pristine, with the same jacket design, slightly different livery and from an earlier date. And we'll just have a look at this. This has really seen some action. And let's just have a look. And this is 74. So I was 11 in 74. So let's see. So I was 10 or 11 when I bought this because my birthday sort of late spring. And I've underlined The Island of Dr. Moreau, selected short stories, The War in the Air, and Anne Veronica. I don't know why I've underlined them. I don't ever remember reading Anne Veronica, one of the social novels, but there you go. And again, I've written in it, and I put SF stroke H book number 7. So there's 6. So with that one, there's another, you know, there's another 5. They're probably the Wyndham ones, but I'll have to have a look. I'm not sure. So I've still got all my original Wyndhams. So there you are, lots of action. And of course, you know, I think when I read this the first time, I might have seen the film. That might have come a bit later. I think I'd seen the film, or it might have been kind of simultaneous. And it was very hard to see SF then. There wasn't much. There was, you know, Doctor Who, there's Star Trek, and occasionally you get a monster movie. And this, though, had a really big impact on me, particularly the early part and the bit where the narrator is trapped in the house with the curate, which I still think is magnificent. And, you know, we still haven't had a really faithful adaptation of War of the Worlds. We need one which is to the letter, because it would be fantastic. And of course it makes you think of steampunk, but of course it wasn't steampunk, it's the original scientific romance. So it's still great. My favourite Wells book is actually The Time Machine, which was his first novel. And I think The Time Machine is the best one. And both the Doyle, the Wyndham and the Wells, they were all bought in Cardiff. I think they were all bought in Lear's, which was the largest bookshop in Cardiff. It was there for about 100 years. It would have been about 2,500, 3,000 square foot max, which seemed like a very big bookshop at the time. It was probably the biggest bookshop in Wales then. It's long gone now. Blackwell took it on some 20 odd years ago, and it was in decline then, and it sort of gradually disappeared. It's a great shame. But it was sort of not sort of doing it anymore, and other bookshops have come and gone. Cardiff is actually under bookshopped. When I left Cardiff, when I was 21, 22, there were, I think, 4 bookshops there, and now there's only really one new bookshop, and there's a Smith's and there's Troutmark, which you've seen me visit. So it's kind of under bookshopped really, so it could do with a bit more. So yeah, so these were probably bought in Lear's, and I still love going in there because it was a sort of long, narrow shop, and there was an entrance on St Mary's Street, which is on the main streets in Cardiff, and a side entrance where one of the arcades, and I used to like going in the side entrance and walking through to the front. And the SF was towards the back. The paperbacks were all at the back when you came into the arcade. And the paperback section was probably a third of the shop, you know. It's different times, you know, and I still love it. I loved going in there right up until I left Cardiff, even though I was working in another bookshop. I did have an interview in there just before I left Cardiff, and I really sort of didn't want to go there. I'd been offered a job in Bath, so that was that. So yeah, so it's an important one. So there we go. the classic stuff. So as you see, there's no sort of really sort of thing avant-garde things at this stage, but you'll note they're all British. So something else I read about that time, and I mentioned Edgar Rice Burroughs earlier on, and this is not my original copy, sadly, and I would like one with the original livery, and I think it was a tandem one. This is a tandem one, but it was a slightly earlier issue than this, is The People That Time Forgot. Now, The People That Time Forgot is, of course, the sequel to The Land That Time Forgot, and I have to say that I think The People That Time Forgot is much, much better. This is a 75 one. Mine is the previous livery to this, and I must try and get one. And it's got a really handsome drawing of a painting of cavemen standing around a sauropod, a brontosaurus, a diplodocus, something like that. And I absolutely loved it, and it's a fascinating book. And Burroughs, of course, he produced Tarzan, the first John Carter book, and they're all within about a year of each other. I say this, he produced The Land That Time Forgot, which isn't anywhere near as good. This is actually much better because there's a trilogy, of course. The third one is called Out of Time's Abyss, and I only actually read that a few years ago. It's a really weird book, but it's fantastic. And Burroughs, I could never be one of those people who could read tons and tons of them, but I've read the key ones, and they are kind of seminal. But unless you want the same thing over and over again, I would say just stick to the initial ones in each particular series. And yeah, because this is a tie-in edition, because there was the film, but mine was an earlier one. So again, it would have been 73, 74. So I was, 10, 11, that sort of thing. And what's great about this is about a guy who sets out to the land that time forgot in a biplane to try and find the sort of people who've got lost in the first volume. And he crashes and he falls in with a young sort of cave woman there. And there's this really interesting thing about the way evolution works, and Caspac, or Caprona as it's often called, and how people can evolve from one type of human being to another. Some do, some don't. And there's this wonderful sort of gradation, this evolutionary chart of different types of people. And as they grow more sophisticated, their weapons grow more sophisticated. There are sort of clubmen, bowmen, spearmen, what have you. And it's really, really interesting. So it's rather like a taxonomic tree of different species of human beings, but actual individuals can evolve. It's a really weird idea, but it's fascinating. And I loved it. And one of my obsessions as a kid was taxonomy, the classification of living things. So that was an important thing. So I kind of related to that structure because taxonomy was one of my fascinations. And at one point, I wanted to be a taxonomist. I wanted to work on classifying living things. But, that never came to pass. But that was one of my obsessions because, of course, you become adolescent and rock and roll and girls and what have you come along. But that was a great one. So I'm looking out for a mint sort of copy of the one which I used to have. And when I get one, I'll show it you. It will happen. I've seen them, but I haven't seen a really nice one or a really nice one. Because, again, I got rid of it. It's a shame. I've had this probably about 10, 15 years. I have reread it. All these books I read and read and read as a kid. I had a small number of books, and I would reread them. And I think that's an important thing. And I think that's what's given me a large part of my critical faculty, is the fact that if you close read a text, you will learn more from it. Things that you missed the first time, you'll really see how good it is. And familiarity can blunt your judgment, but then when you go back after a long time and look again and go through it slowly and fully read it again, you'll often pick things out, and it's quite interesting. And as you get older, because you see the crudities of simple things, and sometimes you see the complexities that you missed, which is very much the case with Wyndham, Wells and Doyle. I have to say, I think they're all magnificent sort of prose stylists and characterization and brilliant ideas. Burroughs slightly less so. So that was kind of my intro into the American pulp style, the magazine style, and of course it's a good 12 or 13 years before Hugo Gernsback started his SF magazine and the term science-fiction was coined. So what was I ready for then? And as I say, there may be other things, but this is what I can remember, and this is roughly the order. Well, the next thing then was, of course, some proper British hard SF. And there it is, 2001, A Space Odyssey. That's my original copy. I have shown this before in one of the Hay videos because I managed to get a pristine one from Derek Adaman last year. And this really has seen a lot of love. It's one way of putting it. I hadn't written anywhere in it, so I was a bit older. And let's see, this is 76. So in 76, I'm 12 or 13. And I think I was 12 because just before that, I remember going on a school trip. And on this school trip, we were in a coach. We stopped somewhere and there was a rack spinner, and of course I got this off my original copy of People off a rack spinner. I didn't get it from Leah's in Cardiff. It was from like a little Valley newsagent. I can't think where. I think it was in Singeni, the Abertrydydd. So it was just over the mountain from where I grew up. But I got it from a rack spinner in a small shop, as you did then. And we were on the school trip, and I bought this book, a slightly different version, but this which I acquired fairly recently, which is The Lost Worlds of 2001, which is all about the making of the film. And I hadn't seen the film, and of course there was no home video then. And, you know, it had gone way past the point where it was re-shown regularly. But my uncle had this soundtrack album, which he'd given to me. And I loved the artwork on the cover. I loved the pictures on the back. I was fascinated about it. The music was mostly classical music, some of it very strange stuff by Ligeti. And I bought this because I wanted to know more about it, and a lot of it baffled me. And shortly after, I bought this novel. And again, I can say I read and read and read this book. I read it, you know, as I say, I used to read and reread these things. And I just was marvelled really at the scope of Clarke's imagination, the ideas, the profound things it said about human origins and alien intervention, the implications for religion, the fact that it starts way, way back before people are even people. And it brings to you that idea about technology. Now, I'm probably going to do a spoiler here if you haven't seen the film or read the book or what have you, but never mind, it is what it is. So you've got time to switch off now if you want to do that. But the interesting thing to me was the monolith, of course, clearly teaches the ape men, you know, how to sort of survive, because they're starving, there's food everywhere, there's lots of meat, but they haven't worked out how to use bones as weapons. And I was thinking about this and thinking about science, and of course technology, the application of science, actually predates humanity. If you think of the tool using animals, if you think of things like crows dropping, you know, pebbles into water to raise food up in a glass, if you think of apes and monkeys using tools, if you think of all sorts of things like that, there's lots of sort of tool use in birds, in corvids, particularly in parrots. You know, it just shows that that's the appliance of scientific thinking, of methodology. You experiment, and you keep experimenting until something works, then you repeat the experiment to make sure it works again, and then you've got your methodology. And a rational methodology that works is the very beginning of science. So science is integral to life, to living things. So science existed before we did, which begs the question, when did science fiction stop? We'll come back to that at another time. So this was the one, and when I try and read it now, and I have in recent years, because I'm so familiar with it, I do find Clarke's prose to be not as good as the other people I discovered after that. And it was kind of obvious to me that he wasn't such a good writer in terms of the characterization and the prose style as people like Wyndham and Doyle. But it was very good, and the ideas were impressive. And I didn't get to see the film till, gosh, when was it? It was the first time it was shown on British television, which must have been, it was well into the 80s. You know, you couldn't see it. So, and that was a great moment. But of course, the interesting thing about the book, and as it says on here, and this is the pristine one I managed to get, isn't that lovely? Which is virtually from the same printing. It's same livery, different printing. This came out about this was the printing which came about a year after that one, and it gone up. The price had almost doubled. It shows you what inflation was like in Britain then. And basically, based on the screenplay by Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke, because of course it's based on the short story The Sentinel, as everybody knows. So this is actually a film tie-in, and there is a video on the channel where I suggest that you might not actually be able to understand 2001 fully unless you've read the book. And this is the thing. I mean, if you pick up a home video, a DVD, a Blu-ray, whatever, there's a blurb on the back, and people have often heard about it. But if you went in and saw it blind and hadn't read the book, because there's not much dialogue, not much exposition, there's just visuals, and the ideas are presented visually, which is one of the limitations of science fiction in the cinema, then would you actually understand it? And of course, when it first came out, people were, there's an awful lot of young people who wanted to see it off their faces on psychedelics. And, it was, man, it was a trip. Yeah, it was also marketed that way. So they kind of grokked it in a way which was, how can we say, instinctive. There's an instinctive understanding, or they thought there was an understanding. Was there a full understanding of the plot, its implications and what have you? The jury is out for me, and of course I read it before I even saw the film. So and that's the thing. I mean, you should really see any film, any science fiction film, to judge it properly. You need to see it blind, without knowing anything about it beforehand, because that way you might actually see how limited the writing is. Is the writing good? Is the infodump crude? That sort of thing. So I think that's a kind of rule really for watching science fiction films. Watch them without knowing anything about them. You'll often end up watching a load of rubbish, of course. That's the trouble. Anyway, speaking of films, something that was on my radar, and I can look at the date and I'm going to see this is a bit earlier, was of course The Planet of the Apes was a TV series at that time, and the film started coming out about 68. And I think the first adult film I saw, and I mean like a non-kids film, I mean not an animation or a Disney streaming thing, was a Disney live action film, would have been Planet of the Apes, funnily enough. I saw biblical epics, and I do have a real sort of fondness of biblical epics. So things like Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments had a massive impact on me, and they both had Charlton Heston in them. And of course, he was in Planet of the Apes. And I saw Planet of the Apes in the cinema, and then I bought this from a newsagent in Caerphilly, which I think is still there. And, there are lots of newsagents had books then, and they had a good range of magazine stuff. They had quite a few SF books. And I was visiting my nan. And Caerphilly was just over the mountain from where I lived in Pontypridd. And this, let's see, is I think from 75. And it says SF horror book number 4 in there. Oh, interesting. So let's see. 75, and maybe that was a ranking. I'm not certain. So 1975, and as you see, it's called Monkey Planet, not Planet of the Apes. Interesting. And in the translation, they're referred to as monkeys, not apes, which of course is scientifically incorrect. And obviously it's a tie-in there, and that's a picture of General Ursus from Beneath the Planet of the Apes, rather than General Urko from the TV series, which is not as good. And as you see, it's in a state. It's seen a lot of action, but I absolutely love it. And I read it many times. It's French, of course. It's quite literary. It's obviously satirical. It's very different to all the film versions. It's much better than all the film versions. It's subtler. It's wittier. There's a certain element of tongue-in-cheek, and the frame narrative and the way it's done is just magnificent. And I think Planet of the Apes is one of the most neglected classic SF novels, which people just haven't read. And it was published about 1960, and Boole had written about, let's see, 5-6 years before that, he wrote Bridge on the River Kwai, which was filmed successful. He wrote another science fiction novel, maybe more. I've never delved into his other stuff very much, and I probably should really, so maybe one day I will. But it's great, and I love it, and I really recommend it. It's great stuff. And obviously, Desmond Morris's Naked Ape was a big book then, a book about human behaviour and comparing us to other primates. So, it was a book which suited the times very much. And I love it. And it's very short. The current UK edition is a vintage one. It's got a sort of cover with 3D glasses inside. They do this series of books which have 3D glasses. So you put them on the cover and it's in 3D. You don't put it on and suddenly see everybody's turned into apes. That happens in Will Self's novel, Great Apes, which is really good. And there was a thing in Great Apes by Will Self where he talks about a film called Planet of the Humans, and then there's Beneath the Planet of the Humans, but there's never any mention of Conquest of the Planet of the Humans. And he sort of does analogues of all the films, and I'm thinking, okay, he's going to do something clever with the plotting with that, and he never does. Will, you let me down there, but it's a fun book, Great Apes, Will Self, but not as good as this. This is much, much better. But do give Great Apes a try. It is one of my favourite Will Self books, and he's a very clever man. He's a big Ballardian, and and a great guy. Met him once, and fantastic speaker. Really is fantastic. So, something else I read at that point, because I hadn't seen it, and I was very big on film tie-ins. It's by a lot of film tie-ins. I have none of them left apart from this one, and this isn't the same copy. I rebought this. This is Battle for the Planet of the Apes by David Gerrold. And of course, David, famous SF writer, who was one of the first out sort of gay SF writers. He wrote Trouble with Tribbles for Star Trek. He's good little writer, David, and very interesting. And this was, and that still is actually a publicity still from Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. This is a masterclass in how you take a okay script that ends up as a terrible film, because it's a really terrible film. It's cheap, they didn't put a lot of effort into it, what have you. And you can make a really compelling novel which addresses all sorts of things about justice and morality, equality, freedom, slavery, all those big metaphoric things that come up in the series. And it's just really good. And, you know, I've read and again read and reread this. And, you know, obviously it was workmanlike in terms of money, but David put a lot into it. And for something which is just done for money, it's much, much, much better than the film. So well done, David. So that was an important one. That sort of showed me the art of how you took an average script that turned into a terrible film and you did a good little novel out of it. And that happened a lot. I mean, one of the classic things that the film tie-in for the Clint Eastwood film, The Enforcer, is much, much better than the film. The film's a lost opportunity. And it's the same with this, really, with a more sensitive director and better budgets. Both of those could have been much better. So that's David Gerrold, Battle for the Planet of the Apes. So Planet of the Apes was a big thing, as you see, and there's a Marvel comic, and there's a TV series. It was, you know, it was a real phenomenon. It was huge. It was the Game of Thrones of its day, which some of you will remember it, some of you won't. So when we move on to about sort of 76, 77, what am I reading then? Well, I'm in school, secondary school, I'm talking to friends. A lot of my friends are reading, you know, The Hobbit. I'd read The Hobbit by that point. They're reading Lord of the Rings, and I'm thinking, oh God, you know, what is this stuff? I'm looking at books by people like Frank Herbert and Robert Heinlein. I'm looking at Asimov. I tried some of the robot stories, not for me. I tried Heinlein. I found it very prurient, and, you know, I Will Fear No Evil, I think was the first one I picked up. I tried Green Hills of Earth. I didn't like the folksy sort of tone of it. I've got both those books now, you know. And it's also Dune. I tried, and Dune to me was dead on the page. You know, the ideas were interesting, but I found it a terribly dull book, and I DNF'd it when I was a kid. And it was so big, and it just didn't really appeal at all. And I was still reading really sort of classic British stuff then. I was reading it from the school library and what have you. This isn't my first sort of edition. I've got it somewhere up there, an omnibus of classic horror novels. It's called, edited by Peter Haining. And I must have had that for Christmas when I was about 14. And it has Frankenstein, Dracula, Phantom of the Opera, and Frankenstein had a massive, massive impact on me. This is a 1818 text, A format paperback from Oxford from about 25 years ago. I'm just flashing that because I am trying to get people to read the 1818 text, which is the one that has more Percy Shelley in it. The more common version is 1831. There's now 3 or 4 different editions in print of the 1818, and you couldn't get it for years. So this is it as it was originally written, and it had a massive impact on me. And I think, you know, if you're a teenager and you think you're an outsider and, you know, everything's tough and what have you, you really relate to the creature. And it's got works on all sorts of levels, the thing about child neglect and what have you. And, you know, and as an SF novel, it's peerless. And also as a romantic novel of the sublime, it's just so important. You know, it's such an important part of literary history, in women's literature, in romantic literature, in looking at sort of co-creation, Shelley and Mary, Lord Byron's involvement, the whole Gothic thing around Villa Diodati. It's just, you know, really is a sort of taproot text for all sorts of things. And I read that about that time, and I absolutely loved it, still do. And again, it was something I read and reread. But it was the 1831 text. The 1818 is better. I prefer it. It's sharper, more stringent, harder, more anti-religious. And, you know, it is the one. But you've got to read them both because it's just great stuff. It really, really is. You know, you didn't do books like this in school when I was a kid. They're in the school library, and that's where I read a lot of things like that. But we didn't get to study them. We were studying things like Jane Austen and George Eliot. You know, I wasn't getting to do stuff like this. Kitchen sink dramas by playwrights like Wesker, who you never hear about these days, was still on the curriculum then. Philip Larkin's poetry, you know, Chaucer, it was tough stuff. You did real literature. You didn't sort of get the sort of nice literature. You didn't get things like Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1984. You didn't get those exciting things. And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was one I read the same time as this because it was in that omnibus as well. So there we are. My favourite novel of all time, and the best science fiction novel ever written, in my humble opinion, will surprise nobody. It's a really, really famous book, one of the most famous books in the world. It grows more relevant every year. You could talk about it for hours. It's pretty much all been said, and that's 1984. And I read this very edition, not this copy, in my school library, and it blew me away. I had seen the Nigel Neal adaptation was shown on BBC Two. It was something like the 20th anniversary of the BBC or something, and they dug it out of the archives and they showed it, and I was riveted by it. I was a big Nigel Neal fan anyway. I love Quatermass, and that was nothing I read at that point. I read some Nigel Neal, the screenplays and what have you, and this is just magnificent. And this copy, I got around to buying it much later because I say I'd read it. I bought it from the school library. And I bought this in 83, so I was actually 20 when I bought this. By that point, I'd read it several times on loan. And that to me is the best livery it's ever had. There's one of the thought police there with a megaphone, frightening as the day is long, the barbed wire, the definitive dystopian SF novel. There is a video on the channel which is about 1984 as science fiction. Because I think people forget, they don't think of 1984 as SF. They don't think the dystopian literature is SF. By default, it's SF. That's what it is. You know, 90% of all SF has dystopian backgrounds, possibly more than that, you know. So, an obvious one. So, as you see, there's some real classic stuff in here. There's not many surprises. Then I started branching out. And the key moment came for me was when I was in John Menzies in Pontypridd. John Menzies is gone now. It's a Scots chain. It was rather like Smith's. Newsagent, confectioner, books, records, what have you, that sort of thing. And that was our sort of best sort of source of books in Pontypridd. We didn't have a dedicated bookshop. There were rack spinners in various places, but Menzies had the best choice. And I'd look through the SF, and the pan lozenge was a big thing then, and use a pan lozenge, Bob Shaw's Other Days, Other Eyes. And I used to think, oh, these books look so cool. But I'd been sort of kind of put off by Asimov, Heinlein and Herbert. Of the big four, Clarke was the only one who did it for me. And I pretty much stuck to 2001. I just had this feeling that maybe it was Kubrick, not Clarke, was the genius. And I think, you know, later on I discovered that was the case. Sorry, Arthur C. Clarke fans. As you know, I've got loads of books by him, and I am revisiting some gradually. But the real moment came for me when I picked up 2 Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. And I haven't chosen to show that this time, because I talked about it in the recent sort of January wrap-up, and I talked about Silverberg and Tower of Glass, and it absolutely blew me away, the seriousness, the domesticity of the characters, what have you. And then in my school library, I picked up this book. This is my second PKD, and this only underlined and put the firmware into me, slotted it into my head, into what good, mature genre SF writing was like by an American. And that was the very, very wonderful Martian Time Slip by Philip Kindred Dick. And it was in this livery, it wasn't this copy. I read it, I say, at school. I had my own copy. I think I sort of got rid of it when I had a hardcover, and then I picked, no, it actually says, no, this must be my original. Gosh, that's really funny. I didn't think I still have my original. This is my original, which I picked up from the Green Bookshop, 19 Market Street, Pontypridd. And yeah, and the Green Bookshop, this is a 77 printing. The Green Bookshop didn't open in Pontypridd till the early 80s, and it was second-hand. It was second-hand bookshop, and also second-hand magazines, comics, records, what have you. And they did naughty books out the back, which was a bit of a shock and a surprise, really. So there you go. And this is magnificent. I mean, this is the book which separates the sheep from the goats. You hear a lot of talk about Dick's major novels. People talk about Do Androids, they talk about Man in the High Castle, Three Stigmata, you know, they talk about all sorts of things. But for me, the sigil of the true dickhead, you know, they talk about Ubik, and these are all great, important books. It's when people start talking about Martian Time Slip, underrated book. I think really this had lots of critical acclaim. This was got an introduction by Aldous, which I read after the fact. I read the book first. I thought I don't want to read that just in case. And it's about plumbing unions on Mars. It's about autism. It's about colonialism. It's got all the big themes in it. And it is simply magnificent. It's got a big cast of characters, a bad sort of union business type person. It's got sort of little men, little women. It's a great sort of combination of the sort of virtues of Man in the High Castle and Android's Dream, and it falls in between them. And it's really, really good. And there's one sequence of this which is very avant-garde experimental, but you don't realise it until you start to read it and something happens. And the book's called Martian Time Slip. I'm not going to tell you what happens. You have to read it for yourself. When you read it, please note, there are not printing errors in the text, okay? They're not printing errors. What happens in there, and you've just got to suck it up and deal with it, and it'll blow your mind. And it blew my mind. And it was the first real piece of experimental writing I read, and it really sort of opened my mind up, and it made me think about the fact that science fiction was meant to be weird. And it was at that moment, reading Dick for the first time, this one and Androids, was when I kind of stepped away from what I'd seen on screens, and it really said to me, there's something else in science fiction which is not getting onto screens, it's not getting into films very much, or at least the films I'd seen at that time. And it still doesn't get into science fiction films very much now. It gets in with the odd exception. So if you haven't read that, do. It shouldn't be your first Philip K. Dick. I think your first one should be one of the more accessible ones, and I think Androids is a great first place to start. But this is really, really, really important book, and I've got a hardcover first, and I absolutely love it. I'm chuffed to see that this is still my original one. I can't get over that. That's great, marvelous stuff. And I had a couple of friends who read Philip K. Dick as well, and people like that. So that was an important thing. You know, your friends, you know, they're influential over you, and vice versa, you influence them. So it started to sort of spread out from there for me then, and I looked at other things, and some of my other early favourites. I'm going to skip over these a bit more quickly because some of them I've already covered. I'm going to cover them in more depth. Other Days, Other Eyes by Bob Shaw. That was a really important book for me. That was my first Shaw. It's still my favourite. Probably I'm too close to it. I'd certainly put it in the top 3 Shaws anyway. And interestingly, it was kind of a fix-up. There's 3 sort of stories, and there's a frame narrative. And my first experience with Shaw was in comics, because in one of the Marvel comics, they did an adaptation of one of the stories, the most famous story, which I think was an award winner before the book was put together. Let's see. And does it say? And it's called The Light of Other Days. It's not meant, there's no contents page. The Light of Other Days is just part of this. And again, it was so mature. The scientific idea was brilliant, and I do think Bob Shaw is a hard SF writer who could take hard science and apply it to human beings, human problems, and really make it feel valid and relevant, that it wasn't something for scientists, it was something for everybody. Just magnificent. And it's a great, great book. So if you only ever read one Bob Shaw, read that one. And again, British. Shaw is more literary than he's given credit for. At his best, he could have written mainstream novels. He didn't. In a way, I'm sad he didn't, because I think he did a good job. I mean, Dagger in the Mind is one I read a while ago. I hadn't read it before. And the mainstream parts, the mainstream sort of aspects of it, the characterization and the sort of visuals, because it's set in contemporary Britain in the late 70s, are just fantastic, brilliant. And I read a Richard Cowper recently, and I was reminded of Shaw. You know, these guys, they can really do it. They can really depict the real world. Or they could, they're no longer with us, sadly. So that was an important one for me, to sort of ground things again, and to show that the Wellesian tradition of, you know, the real world, and then something odd intrudes into it, just was the thing, and was the best sort of SF. I love near-future SF. You know, a lot of the space opera stuff I can live without. Near-future SF, to me, is the thing which is the most convincing and interesting. But I'll read all sorts of SF, as you know. I've mentioned before, Harlan Ellis's The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World is one of my favourite collections. That really opened my head up as well. Also, I'll mention Alfred Bester's The Dark Side of the Earth. There are videos about that book and about this book on the channel. There's also a video about A Clockwork Orange. And by the time I'm reading these, I'm sort of 15, 16, 17. and that's my original copy of Clockwork, which is really spine faded. And do watch that video, because there's two different texts of Clockwork Orange, and I tell you all about them and what happened with that. And that was a big one, and the classic youth book. And of course, in the days of punk rock and after, this was very much the thing, and it was been the thing before that. And Burgess, of course, great experimental writing, but very readable and clever and funny and satirical. I could see the links to Orwell, wonderful dystopian novel, just sort of great stuff, really. So then a little bit of a sidebar, somebody I read a lot of at the time, and she wrote all sorts of books, and I don't know why I picked them up. I think it was the covers more than anything else, because the covers are so beautiful, was Daphne du Maurier. And this is The House on the Strand, which I sort of regard as the definitive time-slip romance. And I mean romance with a capital R. It's about a guy who discovers this drug which allows him to travel mentally back in time to see what's happening at a historic occasion in a historic location. And The House on the Strand is set in Cornwall, where Daphne du Maurier lived. And great SF novel, literary. It appealed to the John Wyndham and Wells fan, and me to the Orwell fan. And it was very interesting, and she could write anything really. I read historical novels by her, contemporary romances, historical romances, thrillers. You know, she's very, very talented, great storyteller. And this is a neglected one, and I love this book. And I had a load for other ones in this livery, and I got rid of them over the years, and some of them I grew out of, and I wish I kept them, really. So she was my sort of go-to woman very much in this phase of my teens. And when did I buy this? Let's just have a look at it, because it's still in really good nick, as you can see. And by this point, I had learned the art of how you look after your books. So let's see, it's Pan, and it's 1981. So I'm 17 or 18 when I read that. Great, great stuff. House on the Strand, Daphne du Maurier, underrated SF classic, and not one that's read that much by her fan base either. You know, they go to Rebecca and a lot of the other famous ones, Jamaica Inn, but that's a great one, really, really good. So if you've never read her, you want to read SF by her, read that. She wrote Don't Look Now, of course, The Blue Lenses. There were some good short stories, you know, really good stuff. Finally, as I sort of went into my late teens, I sort of spread out enormously, and this is a book which really I regard as the sort of crossing point into what became my obsession with English literary SF of the 1960s and 70s and the New Wave movement, and that is Michael Moorcock's The Final Programme. There we go, which I read in about 1981. This is a Fontana one. It's not the original copy I had read. That was the Mayflower Granada one, the Panther one, with a topless woman on it. Ooh, really crude cover. And I should get one, really. I really didn't like it. I just thought it was crude, you know. But yeah, that really, really is fantastic. Final Programme. Jerry Cornelius. Very cool, very witty, avant-garde, new wave, great stuff. I'm going to talk about these at great length at one point, but I would say if you just read one Michael Moorcock book, it's probably not the best one. There's probably others which are better written. Nobody would publish this. He had to do it as a serial in New Worlds, and this is 60s cool at its coolest and 70s cool at its coolest. It's 60s, but you know, it was in the future, set in the future, and Jerry is the man. So those are kind of the books that made me. There were others as well, which I mentioned throughout, some odds and sods. The best in particular, I would say, and I read Bester's novels early on as well. Other things fell by the wayside, so I won't mention them. Those are the important things. One more thing. A book I bought on a rack spinner. It was in Nantgarw, and it would have been in about 1974. I would have been about 11 or 12. I don't have my original copy. It's an author who was long out of copyright. I can't even remember what the cover looked like. If I ever saw one, I'd pick it up. It's an author whose work has sold millions and millions and millions and millions worldwide for, you know, something like 150 years, and that's Edgar Allan Poe. And, you know, there's so many Poe collections, and the fundamental sort of Poe type you get in an average Poe collection would be Tales of Mystery and Imagination. So the one I had, I think, was called that. I can't even remember what it looks like, and I haven't had it for so long, because when this came out, I bought this. And this is the Complete Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe, and I bought this in Cardiff. Very early 80s. I was with my friend Gary, and he bought a copy as well. And this is $3.95. This is what you call an E format. Okay, you don't get E formats It was strictly sort of like a penguin thing, and they did loads of these. They most have really dull covers, and I've read everything in this, and most of it twice, a lot of it 3 times or more. A lot of my favourite stories, the leaves are loose now, sadly. I've read, so many times it's just not true. Let me just have a look what date this was. So let's see, 1982, and this is the first printing. So I was 18 when I got that. Absolutely fantastic. And Poe, of course, just such a seminal writer. Science fiction. He virtually invented the crime story, horror, traveller's tales, all sorts of things, comedy. And of course, his only novel is in here, The Narrative of A. Gordon Pym, aka The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, which is like a massive influence over Lovecraft's At the Mountain of Madness. And of course, Poe's a much better writer than Lovecraft. And every word, is sort of engraved on my soul. And things like, gosh, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Black Cat, The Telltale Heart, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, Descent at the Maelstrom. Oh, it's just bliss. So there you go. Without him, where would we be? Now, Dish wrote an essay, that's Tom Dish, who I've been reading recently, who I absolutely love, about, our embarrassing uncle, Edgar Allan Poe. And of course, he was a drunk, and he had quite a rough life. A dipsomaniac is a wonderful description here, which says, he was a deeply troubled man, and he just goes into how grim his life was. But boy, he left something behind him of worth for all the generations worldwide. Absolutely sublime. So those are kind of the books that made me and sort of helped me forge my taste. And after my teenage years, it broadened out considerably. I read a lot more SF, a lot more mainstream novels and things as well. But these were kind of keynote books for me. A lot of them are well known, most of them are well known. There's not many surprises there, but I wanted to share that with you because it does make me wonder, the common experiences. And as I say, for me, the big four were never the big four. So that's something, is it different in the States? Was I different to other SF readers? There was a time when a lot of SF readers would read the big four. You show them Philip K. Dick and they'd go, oh, I don't read him, he's weird. Well, I read him because he was weird. But maybe that's just me. This is Outlaw Bookseller, signing out for now. Please subscribe, like, comment, super thanks if you desire, and all that stuff. Bye for now.